Hi stats class, it's Miss O'Neill getting ready to go over this week's next lesson, which is perpendicular lines. One of the greatest things that is a takeaway from Mr. Parada's notes is that in order for perpendicular lines to be perpendicular lines, meaning two lines that cross perfectly at a 90-degree angle, you have to have negative reciprocal slopes. So we're still focusing on that M. And unlike parallel lines where we want them to be exactly the same, we want them to be equal, perpendicular lines have to have negative reciprocals. Well, what does that mean? I like to think of it in the way of Missy Elliott's words. We're going to flip it and we're going to reverse it. Those are our two steps in creating a negative reciprocal. So from your notes, we had our first example of 4 over 9. Step number 1, according to Missy Elliott, says we're going to flip it. So whatever is on top goes to the bottom. Whatever's on the bottom goes to the top. Step number 2, reverse it. If it's a positive, to reverse it, we change it to a negative. This would be our new slope. These two right here are complete opposites, which would allow one line to move that way, another line to move completely down the center, not necessarily the center, it could be anywhere, and create a 90-degree angle. Some ways that can trick you. Example number 2 gives you a slope, or an M, of -6. You still have to flip it, and you still have to reverse it. But this begs the question of how am I supposed to flip a number? Well, if we're taking a look at this, right now, -6 would be considered on top. So we would put it on the bottom. But if you're looking at your number, it almost seems like there's nothing there, but we know that's not true. There's always an imaginary 1 that will end up going on top. Now, we have flipped it, we have to reverse it. If it's a negative here, we're gonna make this into a positive there. So our actual negative reciprocal would be 1/6. Example number 3. To get a negative reciprocal, first step is to flip it. Second step is to reverse it. Positive becomes a negative. And this is our negative reciprocal. So now that we're a little bit more familiar with how to make something into a perpendicular line, we're going to be going over your perpendicular lines assignment 1 worksheet, and I'm going to go over questions 3, 7, and 8. Now, one of the biggest things about this worksheet is that Mr. Parada does a really nice job of kind of starting you out on the first 2 questions, where he reminds you in order for you to do anything with a line, because that's what my goal here is. I want to write an equation of a line. So I'm going to, eventually, fill in my pieces for my point-slope equation, which means I need to have a point, check, and a slope somewhere in there. Now, originally what we were doing when we were looking for our slope and our point was we were reminding ourselves which one was our x and our y from our point, and we were pulling out the m value from the equation here. But before doing that, always make sure that you're reading the question. This is asking for a perpendicular line, which means whatever the slope is here, I don't want it to be exactly the same when I put it into this new equation. It has to be flipped and reversed. So, first things first, my equation is y equals, that's fantastic. I now know wherever my x is my m. So in this situation, here is my m, which means the slope of that line was 3/4. If I do nothing to it, I'm creating a parallel line, but I don't want that. So we gotta switch this. Step number 1, flip. Step number 2, reverse. Here is your m, here is your point. Pretty straightforward from here. We're gonna plug in what we have. Y minus y1 is your 8. M is your -4/3. And x is a -4. As I've discussed in the past, those double negatives do technically turn into a positive, which could make the equation look like this. Both of these are accurate. This is technically a little bit more of a simpler form. We're not going and distributing that -4/3. We're not trying to get y alone. This could be your final answer, and so could that, but I like to get rid of those extra negatives. So where it starts to get a little harder, you move down to the page. Just like on your parallel lines worksheet, you are going to have questions towards the bottom. I think 6, 7, and 8 are going to be questions where they are no longer y equals equations, which means even though I'm still trying to write an equation of a line by using y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1, the difference is that I can't find my m straight away, and that's because of here. If I'm looking, minus 3x plus y equals 1. If I want to get y alone, the -3x is on the same side. It's got to switch. And I talked about this in the last video. I prefer to have my x term be written first because we like to see it kind of like that y equals mx plus b form. So if I look in front of the 3, it was positive. If I look in front of the 1, it was also positive. And this is our equation. This just makes it easier so that way when I'm looking for my x term, I don't accidentally think that the 1 is my m. These are still the same exact equation. It's just we tend to like seeing equations like this, then we do that. So my m is a 3. And my point is a 4, 5, x, y. If we reread, we want perpendicular to this equation, which means we want to first flip it, put the 3 on the bottom, imaginary 1 on the top, and then reverse it. It's positive, let's make it negative. Here is your perpendicular slope, your negative reciprocal slope, and your point. When we plug in our values, we have our y, we have our m, and we have our x. No need to do anything with the negative signs, no extra negatives. Okay? Starting out with number 8, we're going to just simply begin with getting rid of this extra part. Because we're trying to be perpendicular, we do need the slope from here. So to start, let's get that -4x onto the other side. 4x is positive, so is the 6. When I divide each piece by 5, we end up with 4/5x and 6/5 as the y-intercept, which we don't care about in here. Now that we have our m, you need to make it perpendicular by flipping it and reversing it. Here's your m, here's your point. Make that equation for number 8. Good luck.